My parents told me I was not welcome at Christmas. I never cried or argued. Instead, I changed every lock in the penthouse. On Christmas Eve, they arrived with gifts, but found their keys useless, their elite guests waiting in the cold and no way inside. By morning, my phone showed 94 missed calls. My name is Valerie, 33 years old, and I am the CEO of a successful venture capital firm. To my family, I am just the disappointment they keep around to clean their messes. Before I tell you how I turned their perfect holiday into a devastating public humiliation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. The Thanksgiving dinner at an exclusive French restaurant felt like a hostile boardroom meeting where I was being publicly fired. My mother Diane carelessly tossed a heavy envelope onto the table. It was the guest list for their annual Christmas Eve gala at their Manhattan penthouse. I reached for it, assuming she wanted me to review the catering orders. Diane snatched the envelope away. "Valerie, you are not coming this year," Diane said, dropping her voice into a chilling tone. "Marcus is inviting his family and his guests are the elite of Wall Street. I do not want them seeing you in your cheap outfits bringing the room down." I set my fork down and looked across the table at my older sister Brittany, the golden child of our dysfunctional family. Brittany laughed softly, leaning against her husband. Marcus was an investment banker, a wealthy African-American man whose family name opened prestigious doors. He carried himself with an arrogance that perfectly matched my sister's entitlement. Marcus reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and casually tossed it directly onto my plate. The bill landed right in my cranberry sauce. "Here you go," Valerie, Marcus said with a condescending smirk. "Buy yourself a frozen dinner so you do not starve while we celebrate success." I did not flinch. 10 years ago, a stunt like this would have sent me running to the bathroom in tears, but I was no longer a helpless scapegoat. I calmly picked up the sticky bill, wiped it on a napkin, and slid it smoothly back across the white tablecloth until it hit his water glass. "Keep it, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "You might need that extra cash for your margin calls next week, given how terribly the tech sector is tanking right now." Marcus lost his smug smile instantly. Diane slammed her glass down on the table so hard the stem threatened to snap. "How dare you speak to your sister's husband that way?" Diane screamed. "You ruin every gathering because you are jealous of Brittany. You have been a selfish brat ever since you refused to drop out of college to pay for your sister's vacation. You let your flesh and blood suffer so you could take useless classes." I simply stared at the woman who gave birth to me. In her distorted mind, my refusal to sacrifice my future to fund a luxury trip for her favorite child was a cardinal sin. I had worked 3 exhausting night jobs to pay my own college tuition while my father Charles gambled away their life savings. But somehow, I was always painted as the selfish villain. Charles finally looked up from his expensive steak. "Enough of this drama," he grumbled. "Valerie, since you will not be attending the gala, you can at least make yourself useful. You will come on the 24th and scrub the penthouse before the catering staff arrives." He tossed a heavy brass spare key across the table. It hit the floor near my shoes. "Pick that up," Charles commanded sharply. "And do not break any crystal glasses while cleaning like you broke your own career prospects." I looked down at the brass key resting on the hardwood floor. I looked up at the 4 faces staring at me with absolute contempt. They believed I was a desperate woman who would blindly accept their abuse to remain in their wealthy orbit. I picked up the spare key, slipping it into my jacket pocket. "I will make sure the penthouse gets exactly the treatment it truly deserves," I said softly. I stood up gracefully, left my coat on the back of the chair, and walked out of the private dining room without uttering another word. The heavy silence I left behind was thick with their smug satisfaction. They foolishly thought they had won. They thought they had firmly put me in my place. But as soon as the elevator doors closed behind me in the restaurant lobby, I pulled out my secure phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart. "David," I said when my security chief answered, "initiate a biometric lock replacement protocol on the penthouse. Erase all access codes and change the manual cylinders immediately. I want the system wiped clean. Only my thumbprint gets past that door from now on." The security chief confirmed the executive order immediately. I ended the call and stepped out into the freezing New York night air, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. My parents loved showing off their lavish lifestyle. They loved making me feel incredibly small in a sprawling home they proudly claimed as their own. What they did not know was that they did not actually own the penthouse. They were completely broke and drowning in debt. I purchased the building 3 years ago through a shell corporation to keep them off the streets. They were living in my house while actively treating me like garbage. In exactly 3 weeks, their pathetic illusion of grandeur was going to crash down around them. The morning after Thanksgiving, I sat behind my custom mahogany desk on the top floor of my venture capital firm, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. My phone buzzed aggressively, vibrating across the polished wood. I picked it up to find a rapid succession of texts from my sister. Chloe had sent a meticulously detailed grocery list that read like a royal mandate. She demanded 2 pounds of white truffles, imported beluga caviar, and a case of vintage champagne. The text beneath the list was dripping with her usual poison. "Consider this your financial punishment for embarrassing Julian at dinner," Chloe wrote. "I expect all of this delivered and properly arranged before you scrub the baseboards on the 24th. Pay for it out of your own pocket. Julian's parents are Boston old money. Do not leave your cheap fingerprints anywhere in our home. Our home." I scoffed, quietly tossing the phone back onto the desk. I turned my attention to the thick manila dossier resting in front of me. The file was labeled with my father's name, Richard Thorne. I opened it and ran my fingers over the bank statements inside. 10 years ago, Richard's chronic gambling addiction had completely bankrupted my parents. They lost our childhood home, their savings, and every shred of their supposed high society dignity. They were facing total ruin while I was working my way through business school. I could have let them fall. Instead, I anonymously purchased the massive Fifth Avenue penthouse through a maze of shell corporations and let them move in rent-free. I allowed my father to believe the apartment was a generous corporate perk from his former investment firm, a token of respect for his past services. My parents eagerly swallowed the lie because it fed their massive egos. They spent the last decade living like royalty on my secret dime, treating the space as proof of their inherent superiority while forcing me to use the service elevator whenever I visited. My office door swung open, interrupting my thoughts. My lead private investigator, a sharp woman named Sarah, walked in holding a bright red folder. "You are going to want to see this immediately," Sarah said, sliding the red folder across my desk. "We dug into your brother-in-law's finances, just like you asked. Julian is not the elite banking prodigy he claims to be." I opened the red folder and began scanning the highlighted documents. Julian's wealthy, aristocratic background was entirely real, but his personal success was a complete fabrication. The documents revealed a frantic and desperate paper trail. Julian had been secretly embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his prominent family's private trust fund. He was desperately trying to cover up massive catastrophic losses from unregulated cryptocurrency trades. "It gets better," Sarah said, tapping a specific page with her pen. "Julian's latest independent investment venture just collapsed completely. He defaulted on a $5 million bridge loan yesterday morning. The creditors are actively preparing to seize his assets." I pulled the default notice closer, my eyes scanning the creditor information. A slow, chilling realization washed over me, morphing quickly into absolute satisfaction. The corporate entity that issued Julian's $5 million loan was Vanguard Holdings. Vanguard Holdings was a subsidiary entirely owned by my venture capital firm. Julian had unknowingly borrowed millions of dollars directly from the cheap, mediocre sister-in-law he had mocked just the night before. "He is bleeding cash," Sarah explained, crossing her arms. "He used his parents' pristine reputation to secure that bridge loan, hoping a quick crypto bounce would let him repay the embezzled trust funds before his father noticed the missing money. Now the crypto market is tanking, The bridge loan is in default, and he has absolutely nothing left. He is a dead man walking. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers as the pieces of my strategy fell perfectly into place. My parents had spent my entire life worshipping the ground Chloe walked on, elevating her and Julian as the ultimate standard of success. They constantly humiliated me to protect their fragile, fabricated reality. They loved to punch down because it kept them from looking at the massive failures in their own lives. But gravity was finally coming for them. Sarah, I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. I want you to contact our legal department right now. Tell them to draft an official notice of immediate loan recall for Julian's defaulted account. Ensure the language is absolutely ruthless. We are seizing everything he owns to satisfy the debt. Sarah nodded, taking out her notepad. When do you want the legal notice delivered to him? I glanced at the grocery list Chloe had texted me, demanding imported caviar for her elite Boston in-laws. The same in-laws Julian was actively robbing blind. Schedule the delivery of the loan recall for exactly 6 o'clock in the evening on Christmas Eve, I instructed. Have it hand-delivered directly to the Penthouse lobby. Make sure the courier requires Julian's personal signature in front of whoever happens to be standing there with him. Sarah grinned, understanding the exact magnitude of the trap I was setting. It will be done, she said, turning on her heel and marching out of the office to execute the order. I turned my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city. I thought about my mother's sneer at Thanksgiving. I thought about the crisp $100 bill Julian had thrown into my food. They demanded I clean their home. They demanded I cater to their elite guests. They thought they held all the power because they lived in a penthouse and wore expensive clothes. I picked up my phone and replied to Chloe's demanding text message. I will make sure the delivery on Christmas Eve is absolutely unforgettable, I typed. I locked the screen and let out a long, slow breath. The trap was perfectly set. In exactly 3 weeks, their pathetic illusion of grandeur would end permanently. The holidays were going to be truly perfect. Fast forward to 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The winter air outside was biting, but inside my corner suite at the Plaza Hotel, the temperature was perfectly controlled. I stood near the expansive window holding a glass of red wine. Directly across Fifth Avenue, the gleaming facade of my building towered into the darkening sky. The penthouse, usually blazing with lights for my mother's extravagant holiday preparations, sat completely dark. I walked over to the velvet sofa and picked up my tablet. The screen displayed a high-definition live feed from the security cameras in my lobby. I tapped the screen to enlarge the view. Everything was quiet. Then a sleek black limousine glided to a halt in front of the brass revolving doors. The uniformed driver hurried out to open the rear passenger door. The show was finally beginning. I took a slow sip of wine and settled into the cushions, my eyes locked on the screen. My mother, Patricia, was the first to emerge from the vehicle. She wore a floor-length white mink coat that screamed desperation masquerading as wealth. Next came my father, Richard, adjusting his silk tie and barking an order at the driver. Chloe stepped out next, clinging tightly to Julian's arm. Julian wore a custom tuxedo, flashing a hollow smile. Finally, Julian's parents exited the limousine. They were the epitome of Boston old money, wearing understated but expensive winter wear. They carried an air of quiet authority that my parents constantly tried to mimic. A hotel porter began unloading an absurd mountain of wrapped gifts from the trunk. Patricia led the procession into the marble lobby with the grand gestures of a reigning monarch. She gestured toward the soaring ceilings and the massive crystal chandelier, taking credit for a building she did not own. Through the tablet speaker, I could hear the sharp clicking of her designer heels echoing against the marble floor. Chloe laughed loudly at something Julian's father said, tossing her hair. They moved as a single arrogant unit toward the private elevator bank at the far end of the lobby. This elevator was reserved exclusively for the penthouse. I watched Richard step ahead of the group to do the honors. He pulled his black access card from his wallet with a theatrical flourish, making sure Julian's parents noticed the exclusive metallic gleam. He swiped the card over the reader next to the golden elevator doors. The machine emitted a sharp buzzing tone. The indicator light flashed a brilliant red. Access denied. Richard frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in confusion. He swiped the card a second time, pressing it harder against the sensor. Another harsh buzz, another red flash. Patricia let out a nervous little laugh, turning to her elite guests with a forced smile. "It is just a minor technical glitch," she assured them, her voice tight with rising panic. "You know how these modern security systems are always overly sensitive." Richard muttered a curse under his breath and pushed the screen panel to reveal the manual keypad. He quickly punched in his personal identification number. The system locked him out instantly. The elevator doors remained firmly shut. I smiled, tracing the rim of my wineglass with my finger. The veneer of high society grace dissolved in a matter of seconds. Richard slammed his fist against the brass panel. He spun around and stormed toward the front concierge desk, his face flushing a deep crimson. "Hey!" he shouted, pointing an aggressive finger at the young man behind the desk. "Fix this ridiculous glitch right now. I have important guests waiting, and I do not have time for your incompetence." The young concierge stood his ground. "I am sorry, sir," he replied calmly. "There is no glitch in the system." Richard slammed both hands flat on the polished marble desk, leaning over it to intimidate the worker. "Do you know who I am?" Richard roared, his voice echoing loudly through the massive lobby. "I am the owner of that penthouse. I will have you fired and blacklisted from this city by tomorrow morning." Watching him scream brought back a flood of toxic memories. This was exactly how Richard treated anyone he viewed as beneath him. He used volume and cruelty to mask his profound failures. When I was 16 and working a minimum wage retail job to buy my school books, Richard would come into my store and loudly criticize my folding techniques just to feel powerful. He was a bitter man who lost his fortune to bad bets, yet he still walked through the world demanding absolute subservience. Julian's parents watched this vulgar display of temper with undisguised shock. They stood frozen near the mountain of Christmas gifts, their polite smiles completely vanishing. Julian stepped forward, attempting to physically pull Richard away from the desk to salvage the situation. Just as Richard raised his hand to slam it against the marble again, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit emerged from the security office. It was David, my head of security. He walked directly toward the furious group, his posture rigid and commanding. "I apologize, sir," David said, his deep voice carrying clearly over the lobby feed. "But your guest privileges were permanently revoked at 3:00 this afternoon by the legal property owner. You are currently trespassing on private property, and I must ask you to vacate the premises immediately." The entire group stopped breathing. Patricia's jaw dropped open. This harsh reality finally caught up to them in a public way. Richard lowered his hand, the aggressive flush draining from his face, leaving him pale and terrified. Julian stared at David in absolute disbelief. Julian's mother, a woman who possessed decades of aristocratic poise, slowly turned her head. She raised a single sharp eyebrow and fixed her piercing gaze directly on my mother. "Guest privileges?" Julian's mother asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I thought you owned this penthouse, Patricia." Through the high-definition screen of my tablet, I watched the absolute blood drain from my mother's face. Patricia's carefully constructed mask of high society elegance shattered into a million pieces. She opened her mouth to respond to Julian's mother, but only a pathetic, breathless stammer came out. Richard puffed up his chest, stepping aggressively toward my security chief, David. He pointed a trembling finger, his face purple with outrage, but David did not even blink. David simply crossed his massive arms and repeated that they had exactly 5 minutes to vacate the private lobby before he summoned law enforcement to remove them forcefully. The absolute panic radiating from my family was palpable, even through the silent video feed. Beside me on the marble coffee table of my Plaza Hotel suite, my secure phone began to vibrate violently. The sleek device danced across the polished stone. It was exactly 5:12 in the evening. I did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I leaned back against the plush velvet sofa, took another slow sip of my Cabernet, and watched the notification screen light up. The first wave came from my sister. Chloe fired off a rapid barrage of texts, each one more frantic than the last. "Stop playing these stupid games and fix the door right now," the first message read. 10 seconds later, another arrived. "Julian's parents are freezing in the lobby. Fix the glitch. You are ruining my Christmas." I watched on the camera as Chloe furiously tapped at her screen, entirely ignorant of the fact that there was no glitch. There was only a newly enforced boundary, and she was standing on the wrong side of it. The vibrating phone escalated from texts to incoming calls. Richard's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring out. He called again. I let it go to voicemail. He called a third time, a fourth, a fifth. The notification counter at the top of my screen climbed with astonishing speed. 20 missed calls, 40 missed calls, 60 missed calls. They were standing in a brilliantly lit, freezing marble lobby, utterly humiliated in front of the exact aristocratic family they had spent years trying to impress, and their only lifeline was the daughter they had repeatedly discarded. I tapped the voicemail icon and selected my father's first message, putting it on speakerphone so his voice filled the luxurious suite. "Valerie, you fix this right now." Richard roared through the speaker, the background noise of the lobby echoing behind his furious tone. "I know you did something to the system. You are sabotaging our property because you are bitter about not being invited tonight. Get down here and manually override this junk immediately, or I swear I will call the police and have you locked up for vandalism." I smiled, listening to his hollow threats. He truly believed he possessed the authority to command me. He still thought he was the master of a domain that I had purchased with my own hard-earned capital. The missed call counter hit 94. 94 frantic attempts to reach the woman they had told to eat a frozen dinner alone. I tapped the next voicemail. This one was from Patricia. Her approach was entirely different from Richard's aggressive screaming. As soon as the audio started, I heard the manufactured, trembling sobs that she had perfected over decades of psychological manipulation. "Valerie, sweetie, please pick up the phone." Patricia cried, her voice dripping with artificial distress. "Why are you doing this to us on Christmas Eve? I know you are feeling jealous of your sister. I know it is hard for you to see Chloe happily married to a wealthy man while you are entirely alone, but punishing us for your romantic failures is cruel." I closed my eyes as a sharp, familiar memory surfaced. The words she used were nearly identical to the speech she had given me 10 years ago. I was in my final year of college when I discovered Chloe had been secretly sleeping with my long-term boyfriend, Liam. When I confronted them, Chloe played the victim, weeping that it was a mistake. But it was Patricia's reaction that had truly scarred me. Patricia had cornered me in the kitchen using that exact same sobbing, manipulative tone. She blamed me for the betrayal. She told me I was too focused on my business degree and that Chloe was simply comforting a man who felt neglected. Patricia demanded I apologize to my sister for ruining the family peace. She twisted my heartbreak into a weapon against me, cementing Chloe as the golden child and me as the bitter outcast. Now listening to Patricia use the same twisted logic to blame me for their current predicament, I felt nothing but absolute liberation. The guilt she used to inflict on me had completely evaporated. I deleted her voicemail before she even finished her final sobbing plea. I turned my attention back to the security feed. Julian was furiously pacing the lobby floor, holding his phone to his ear, his handsome face distorted with rage. Julian's parents stood rigidly near the exit, their posture radiating absolute disgust. They were looking directly at my parents, finally seeing the chaotic, fraudulent mess beneath the expensive clothing. A new voicemail notification popped up. It was Julian. I tapped the screen and his arrogant, aggressive voice filled my hotel suite. "Listen to me, you pathetic loser," Julian snarled. "I do not know what kind of childish cyber hack you pulled on this building's mainframe, but it is not funny. My parents are highly respected figures in this city. You are embarrassing my family. I am calling the NYPD right now, and I am going to have you arrested for criminal hacking and trespassing. You are going to spend Christmas in a holding cell. I watched him on the live feed, breathing heavily, trying desperately to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his grasp. He thought he was intimidating a weak, isolated woman. He had no idea he was threatening the chief executive officer of the very venture capital firm that was currently seizing his entire life. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat. I watched their tiny digital avatars indicating they were all actively staring at the screen waiting for my surrender. I typed a single concise reply, feeling the ultimate weight of the moment. Call them. I wrote my thumb, pressing the send button with absolute certainty. Make sure they check the property deed when they arrive. Richard stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The formidable presence of Julian's father, a man whose judicial gavel had destroyed lesser men completely, paralyzed my father. The judge took a step closer, his tailored wool coat sweeping the marble floor. I asked you a question, Richard. Why are the police threatening to arrest you for trespassing in a building you claim to own? Patricia let out a high, thin whine, clutching her white mink coat tightly against her chest. She looked at Richard silently, begging him to spin one of his usual masterful lies. But the reality of the master deed in the hands of the NYPD officers had stripped away his favorite weapon. He had absolutely nothing left to say. Seeing his prized-in-laws collapsing under the pressure, Julian desperately attempted to seize control of the narrative. He stepped sharply between his furious parents and my trembling family, throwing his arms out in a placating gesture. "Dad, please," Julian said, forcing a smooth, practiced chuckle that echoed terribly in the cavernous lobby. "This is just a massive misunderstanding. Maya is severely disturbed. She has been obsessed with Chloe's success for years." Julian turned his attention to me, his handsome face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, stepping away from the police officers to close the distance between us. "You are just a bitter, lonely woman trying to ruin us because you are broke," Julian yelled, his voice cracking with the strain of his performance. "You forged these ownership documents just to create a scene and humiliate my wife. You are a pathetic, jealous liar who cannot stand that we have everything, while you have absolutely nothing." The sheer audacity of his projection was almost impressive. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let his desperate accusations hang in the freezing air of the lobby, allowing the silence to magnify his complete lack of control. I looked him up and down, taking in the faint sheen of sweat forming on his forehead and the slight tremor in his hands. "I am broke," I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that made the police officers stand down and watch the spectacle unfold. That is incredibly rich, coming from a man who just defaulted on a $5 million bridge loan yesterday morning. Julian stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His arms fell limply to his sides. Chloe grabbed his sleeve, her eyes wide with sudden sharp confusion. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Chloe demanded, shaking his arm. "What $5 million loan?" Julian ignored his wife. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, the arrogant facade shattering completely. "How do you know about that?" He whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. "I own Vanguard Holdings, Julian," I stated, enunciating every single syllable for maximum impact. "I am the chief executive officer of the venture capital firm that issued your bridge loan. You borrowed my money to cover up your catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. And when you defaulted yesterday, you legally forfeited every single asset you currently possess. You are entirely bankrupt." My parents gasped in unison. Patricia stumbled backward, leaning heavily against a marble pillar for support. The golden son-in-law, the aristocratic savior she had paraded around high society, was officially penniless. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of my trap. I reached into my structured designer bag and pulled out the heavy sealed dossier Sarah had handed me earlier that day. I bypassed Julian entirely and walked directly over to his father. The judge watched me approach his posture, rigid, his eyes burning with a demand for the truth. I held the dossier out to him. Julian has been lying to you about his financial independence for years, I explained, keeping my tone perfectly respectful to the older man. When his unregulated crypto trades collapsed, he needed a massive influx of cash to satisfy his aggressive creditors. He used his position to quietly drain your family assets. Julian let out a panicked, guttural shout. Dad, do not look at that. She is lying. It is a complete fabrication. Do not touch that file. The judge ignored his son's frantic pleas. He took the dossier from my hands and broke the seal. He flipped the cover open, his trained eyes immediately scanning the highlighted bank transfers, the offshore account routing numbers, and the forged authorization signatures. The lobby fell into a deathly silence, broken only by the sharp rustle of the thick paper as the judge turned page after page. I watched the older man's face transform. The initial confusion morphed into shock, which rapidly darkened into a profound, devastating rage. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He stopped on a specific page, his eyes locking onto a specific transaction history. His hands began to shake, crinkling the edges of the financial ledger. Julian's mother stepped closer to her husband, peering over his arm to read the document. She let out a sharp, devastated gasp, covering her mouth with her gloved hand. She looked at her son as if he were a complete stranger, her eyes filling with tears of absolute betrayal. Julian, the judge, whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, contained fury. He slowly lowered the dossier and looked at his son. You stole from your own sister's medical fund. Chloe shrieked, backing away from Julian as if he were radioactive. Richard and Patricia stared at the man they had worshipped, their mouths hanging open in silent horror. The elite prodigy had not just lost his money, he had actively robbed his sick sibling to save his own skin. Julian's mind snapped. The exposure was too sudden, too absolute. He let out a feral, desperate roar. He lowered his head and lunged directly at me, his hands reaching out to grab my throat. He did not make it past the first step. The two NYPD officers reacted with lightning speed. They intercepted his charge, grabbing his arms and driving their combined weight forward. They tackled Julian hard onto the polished marble floor. The impact echoed with a sickening thud, immediately followed by the sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists. The two NYPD officers hoisted Julian to his feet. He thrashed wildly, his expensive tailored suit twisting and tearing under the officers' firm grips. He looked like a feral animal caught in a steel trap, shouting desperate, incoherent obscenities that bounced off the polished marble walls. The pristine, untouchable image of the Boston elite was entirely destroyed in a matter of seconds. Chloe collapsed. Her knees hit the hard stone floor with a sharp, sickening crack, but she did not even register the physical pain. Her entire manufactured reality, the wealthy husband, the aristocratic in-laws, the guaranteed future of luxury, was disintegrating before her very eyes. She let out a raw, guttural scream that tore from her throat, her hands grasping frantically at the empty air. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive silk gown tangling around her legs, begging the police officers to stop. She sobbed that this was all a massive mistake, that they were arresting the wrong man, that Julian was a respected investment banker who would never commit a crime. When the officers completely ignored her hysterics, continuing to drag a struggling Julian toward the exit, Chloe turned her desperate, streaming eyes toward our mother. "Help him, Mom," Chloe begged, her voice cracking and pathetic. "Do something. Call your lawyers. Use your connections. Make them stop right now." But Patricia was a statue carved from solid ice. She stood perfectly frozen, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the lapels of her white mink coat. She was completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated humiliation of being exposed in front of genuine high society. The judge and his wife were standing mere feet away, witnessing the sordid criminal truth of the family Patricia had spent years trying to impress. Patricia could not speak. She could not move to comfort her favorite child. She simply stared blindly at the floor, prioritizing her shattered social standing over her daughter's frantic, agonizing pleas. Finding no refuge in her mother, Chloe locked her sights directly on me. Her sorrow instantly mutated into a vicious, frantic rage. She scrambled to her feet, her high heels slipping wildly on the slick marble, and lunged in my direction. David, my security chief, stepped seamlessly into her path, crossing his massive arms like an impenetrable brick wall. Chloe halted abruptly, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my face. "You ruined my marriage!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the vast, freezing lobby. "You did this on purpose. You have always been jealous of me. You are just a bitter, lonely woman trying to ruin us because you are broke and miserable." I looked at my sister, watching the expensive mascara run down her cheeks in dark, ugly rivers. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the supreme clarity of final, undeniable justice. I let out a short, sharp laugh that cut through her frantic hysterics like a steel blade. "I did not forge his bank statements, Chloe," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the space, steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I did not force your husband to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own sick sister, just like I did not forge your college degree that Mom bought for you." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Chloe gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, as if I had physically struck her. I took a deliberate step forward, refusing to let her escape the harsh glare of the truth. "Did you really think I never knew about the massive six-figure donation Patricia made directly to the admissions office?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly calm and piercing. "You paraded around for 4 years with academic honors you could barely spell while I worked night shifts to pay for my own textbooks. Your entire life is a purchased fiction, Chloe. Julian was just the latest expensive accessory you could not actually afford." Julian's mother had heard enough. She stepped forward, her posture radiating a cold, terrifying dignity that no amount of money or manipulation could ever buy. She looked down at Chloe with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, then shifted her freezing glare to Patricia. She did not yell. She did not raise her voice. Her quiet fury was infinitely more destructive than Chloe's loud, messy screaming. "The wedding is over," Julian's mother stated, her words dropping like heavy, jagged stones into the quiet lobby. "The marriage is annulled. My lawyers will have the paperwork drafted and filed before midnight. You and your fraudulent, pathetic family will never see a single dime of our money again. Do not ever attempt to contact us." She turned on her heel, linking her arm tightly through her husband's. The judge did not even spare a final parting glance for his disgraced son. They walked out of the building with their heads held high, stepping through the revolving glass doors and disappearing into the freezing New York night. The NYPD officers followed closely behind them, dragging a sobbing, completely defeated Julian toward the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting patrol cars. The heavy revolving doors spun to a slow halt. The lobby was suddenly suffocatingly quiet. Only the sound of Chloe's jagged, uneven breathing filled the cavernous space. Richard and Patricia were left standing alone in the total ruins of their grand illusion. The aristocratic connection they had banked their entire future on was gone forever. The golden son-in-law was headed directly to a holding cell. Every lie they had ever told had been systematically dismantled in a matter of minutes. The sheer magnitude of the disaster finally shattered Richard's state of shock. His face flushed a dangerous mottled purple. He whipped around to face Patricia, his eyes bulging with a sudden frantic panic that stripped away every ounce of his polished demeanor. The illusion of the wealthy, controlled patriarch vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate, cornered man facing total annihilation. He threw his hands into the air, spittle flying from his lips as he lost all control. "I told you we shouldn't have used the penthouse as collateral!" Richard screamed, the sound tearing violently through the quiet lobby. "I told you this was going to blow up in our faces." I stopped dead. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. The deep satisfaction of the evening instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, ringing alarm in my mind. I stared at the man who called himself my father. The penthouse, the multi-million-dollar property I had purchased anonymously through a blind trust to save them from homelessness 10 years ago. the property I legally entirely owned. I stepped past David, closing the distance between Richard and myself until I was standing inches away from him. My voice dropped to a dangerous, lethal whisper. Collateral for what? Richard stared at me, his eyes darting frantically around the lobby as if searching for an emergency exit that did not exist. The purple rage had completely drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent gray. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked from my unyielding expression to the revolving doors where Julian had just been dragged away in handcuffs. The psychological weight of the moment crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant facade. He promised me it was entirely foolproof. Richard babbled, his voice a pathetic, trembling wheeze. He stepped back, wrapping his arms around his own torso, as if trying to hold himself together. Julian had access to a closed liquidity pool. He said the algorithm guaranteed a 400% return within 30 days. I just needed to provide the initial capital. I needed liquidity, Maya. You have no idea how expensive it is to maintain our lifestyle. I took another slow, deliberate step forward. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing off the polished marble walls. So you forged the ownership documents to a multi-million-dollar property you do not own. We had a contact in the city records office, Richard stammered, sweat beading on his forehead and dripping down his neck. He altered the digital deed just long enough for the private lenders to verify the collateral. It was only supposed to be temporary. We took out a $3 million loan against the Penthouse to dump into Julian's crypto fund. He swore the returns would cover the principal before the first interest payment was even due. He swore to me we would be rich again. I stared at the man who had spent my entire life calling me a failure. I felt a profound, chilling detachment wash over me. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity was breathtaking. You did not just take out a bad loan, Richard. I stated, my tone clinical and precise. You forged real estate documents on a property held by a corporate blind trust. You pledged assets you do not own across state lines to secure unregulated funds. You and Julian did not just make a poor investment. You committed massive, undeniable federal fraud. You are going to federal prison. Patricia let out a strangled gasp. The reality of the word prison finally pierced through her delusion. She dropped her designer clutch, the expensive leather slapping against the hard floor. Richard, shut your mouth immediately, she hissed, her voice vibrating with a desperate, aristocratic panic. Do not say another word to her. She is recording this. She is trying to trap us. I did not need to trap them. They had built their own cage, locked the door, and handed me the key. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my secure smartphone. For 5 years, I had allowed them to use a secondary credit card linked directly to my primary banking account. I had initially provided it to them under the guise of an emergency fund for groceries and basic utilities. Naturally, Patricia had weaponized my generosity. She used it to fund her lavish lifestyle, racking up tens of thousands of dollars a month in luxury dining, spa treatments, and designer clothing. I had silently paid the exorbitant bills every single month, choosing to absorb the financial abuse rather than engage in their endless, exhausting drama. But that era of my life was officially over. I opened my banking application. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the lobby. I navigated to the authorized user accounts. I found Patricia's name. I hovered my thumb over the bright red button on the screen. Maya put that phone away. Patricia commanded desperately, trying to summon her old, terrifying authority. You are making a spectacle of yourself. We are done engaging with your psychotic jealousy. I pressed the button. The digital lock clicked into place. The account was instantly frozen, effectively severing their very last financial lifeline to the world of the elite. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and offered my mother a smile completely devoid of warmth. Fine. Patricia huffed violently, adjusting her white mink coat and lifting her chin in a pathetic display of salvaged dignity. We do not need your charity anyway. We are leaving this ridiculous circus. I will not stand here and be insulted by a bitter, ungrateful child. We will go stay at the Waldorf until Richard's lawyers sort out this terrible misunderstanding. She turned on her heel and marched directly toward the Plaza Hotel concierge desk, located a few yards away. The desk clerk, A young man in a pristine uniform had been watching the entire spectacle with wide, fascinated eyes. He quickly snapped to attention as Patricia approached. "I require a royal suite for the evening, and I need you to summon a private luxury SUV to transport us immediately," Patricia ordered, slamming her heavy platinum card onto the marble counter. The clerk nodded politely, his professional training overriding his obvious shock. "Right away, madam," he murmured. He picked up the card and swiped it through the terminal. The machine let out a sharp negative beep. The clerk frowned. He wiped the magnetic strip and swiped it a second time. The machine beeped again, displaying a glaring red error message. "I am incredibly sorry, madam," the clerk said, his voice hushed and apologetic. "Your card has been declined." Patricia's eyes widened in sheer horror. "Run it again," she demanded, her voice cracking. "That is a platinum account with no preset spending limit. Your machine is clearly broken." "It is not the machine." "Mom," Chloe sniffled, pushing herself up from the floor. She shoved past her mother, wiping her ruined makeup with the back of her hand. Her hands were shaking violently as she pulled a sleek black card from her own purse. "Julian set up a secret emergency account for me through his primary holding company. Use this one." The clerk took Chloe's card with a hesitant nod. He swiped it through the terminal. The machine emitted the exact same harsh, unforgiving beep. "Declined, miss," the clerk stated, sliding the card back across the marble surface. Chloe stared at the piece of plastic as if it had burst into flames. She looked at me, the terrifying reality of her situation finally sinking in. The holding company Julian used to fund her secret emergency account was the exact same company my venture capital firm had just aggressively seized. Every single asset, every hidden account, every last dollar had been frozen and confiscated. They were utterly and completely ruined. They had no penthouse. They had no credit. They had no cash, no allies, and no escape. I turned away from the desk, wrapping my coat tightly around my shoulders. I walked toward the heavy glass revolving doors, pausing just before stepping out into the freezing New York winter. I looked back over my shoulder at the three of them standing paralyzed in the opulent lobby, stripped of everything they had ever valued. "It is freezing outside," I stated, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "You had better find a shelter." The heavy glass doors of the Plaza Hotel closed behind me, shutting out the pathetic sight of my family standing paralyzed in the lobby. The freezing New York winter air hit my face, crisp and incredibly refreshing. I stepped into the back of my waiting town car and directed my driver to take me home to the Fifth Avenue penthouse. I slept that night with a profound, untroubled peace I had not felt in over a decade. The next morning, Christmas Day, broke bright and clear. The morning sun flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my dining room, illuminating the expansive view of Central Park, covered in a fresh blanket of pristine white snow. The penthouse was completely silent, free from the chaotic, demanding energy of the people who had occupied it for 10 years. I sat at the edge of the massive mahogany dining table, wearing a comfortable silk robe, enjoying a lavish breakfast I had arranged entirely for myself. I spread a generous portion of beluga caviar over a freshly toasted blini, poured a glass of vintage champagne, and savored the absolute perfection of the moment. The imported white Alba truffles Chloe had so venomously demanded I purchase were sitting on my kitchen counter, waiting to be shaved over my dinner later that evening. My peaceful solitude was interrupted by the sharp ringing of my tablet resting on the table. I glanced at the screen. It was an incoming FaceTime call from an unknown number. I took a slow sip of my champagne, considering whether to answer. Curiosity won out over my desire for total silence. I tapped the green icon, and the screen flickered to life. The high-definition display immediately revealed a visual so depressing it almost looked staged. Richard's face filled the screen. He looked like he had aged 20 years overnight. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken with dark, bruised bags hanging beneath them. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. Behind him, the background was a stark, jarring contrast to the opulent luxury they were accustomed to demanding. They were crammed into a dingy, incredibly cheap motel room. The wallpaper behind his head was a sickly yellow color, peeling away from the corners in damp strips. A flickering fluorescent light cast a harsh, unnatural glare over the small space. I could clearly see Patricia sitting on the edge of a mattress, covered in a faded, questionable floral bedspread, staring blankly at the wall. Chloe was curled up in a cheap plastic chair near the window, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Maya, sweetie." Richard began, his voice dropping into a soft, desperately affectionate tone that made my skin crawl. "Please, just listen to me for a minute." I did not respond. I simply took another bite of my caviar, letting him squirm under my silent, unyielding gaze. "It is Christmas morning." Maya Richard continued, forcing a weak, wavering smile that completely failed to reach his desperate eyes. "We should not be doing this. Families fight, they say terrible things to each other, but they always forgive. We are your blood. Think about your grandmother. Think about my mother. She would be absolutely heartbroken seeing our family torn apart like this on her favorite holiday. She loved us all equally, and she always wanted us to stay united no matter what happened." The mention of my grandmother shattered the calm detachment I had maintained all morning. My grip tightened around the delicate stem of my champagne flute so hard the crystal threatened to snap. My face hardened into a mask of pure, unforgiving stone. My grandmother was the only person in that entire lineage who had ever looked at me with genuine love. She was the only one who never compared me to Chloe, who never told me I was too quiet or too focused on my studies. She had believed in my potential when Richard and Patricia had actively tried to crush it. "Do not ever speak her name again," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy register that completely silenced the sniffling coming from Chloe in the background. "You do not get to invoke her memory to save yourself from the consequences of your own greed." Richard blinked, taken aback by the sheer venom in my response. "Maya, I am just saying she wanted the best for all of us." "She wanted the best for me," I corrected him harshly, "and she tried to ensure I had it. But you could not even let her do that, could you, Richard?" His eyes darted nervously to the side, a flash of genuine panic breaking through his manufactured paternal warmth. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I leaned closer to the tablet camera, making sure he could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. "I know the truth about her estate, Richard. I know exactly what you did when she passed away 12 years ago. You sat me down in the living room of our old house and told me with tears in your eyes that grandmother had died with massive, unexpected debts. You told me her estate was completely bankrupt and there was absolutely nothing left. You watched me cry for the woman who raised me, and then you casually informed me that the college fund she had promised me did not exist." Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. "Maya, the financial situation was complicated back then. The markets were volatile." "It was not complicated at all," I interrupted, shutting down his pathetic attempt at a lie. "It was remarkably simple. She left a substantial sum of money in a private account designated exclusively for my university tuition. She wanted to guarantee I could finish my business degree without taking on crippling debt. But you had power of attorney during her final weeks. You drained that account entirely. You stole your own daughter's inheritance to cover your mounting gambling debts and to buy Chloe that ridiculous imported sports car she wrecked 3 months later." Patricia slowly turned her head toward the screen, her mouth hanging open. She had clearly been complicit in the theft, but hearing it spoken aloud in the harsh light of their current ruin stripped away the final layers of their aristocratic illusion. "You forced me to work 3 separate night jobs just to keep myself enrolled," I said, the memory of that bone-deep exhaustion fueling my current fury. "I survived on cheap instant noodles and coffee. I walked miles in the freezing snow because I could not afford a subway pass. I nearly starved and I nearly dropped out because my own father stole the single lifeline my grandmother had given me. You watched me suffer every single day, and you never lost a moment of sleep over it." Richard raised his hands in a placating gesture, his face slick with nervous sweat. "Sweetie, I was trying to save the family business. I was going to pay it back. I swear to you, I was going to make it right." "You are never going to make it right," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality, "because you are going to spend the rest of your life paying for it. I did not just freeze your accounts last night, Richard. I spent the last month quietly executing a legal strategy you cannot possibly escape. His hands began to shake violently. What did you do? I found the original, untampered copy of her will in a private safety deposit box you never knew she maintained. I revealed, watching the remaining color drain entirely from his face. She kept a pristine record of every account she intended to leave me, along with a sworn affidavit from her personal attorney. You committed grand theft and you committed fraud against an estate. Richard opened his mouth, but only a desperate, suffocating wheeze came out. My lawyers filed the lawsuit for grand theft against you at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I said coldly, glancing at the antique clock on my wall. The local authorities already have the entire dossier. Enjoy your Christmas in that motel, Richard. It is the nicest room you are going to see for the next 10 years. I tapped the red button on the screen, instantly cutting off his frantic, pleading scream. The tablet went completely black. I picked up my champagne glass, took a slow, deeply satisfying sip, and turned my attention back to the beautiful, quiet snow falling over the city. My perfect solitude lasted exactly 12 minutes before the outside world decided to intrude once again. The sharp, incessant buzzing of my personal cell phone broke the absolute silence of the penthouse. I ignored the first 3 calls, assuming Richard had found another cheap motel phone to harass me from. But then my primary business line began to ring simultaneously. My tablet screen lit up with a cascading waterfall of notifications. Dozens of alerts turned into hundreds within a matter of seconds. I set my champagne glass down on the mahogany table and picked up my device, my eyes narrowing at the sheer volume of digital chaos erupting across my screens. My corporate email inbox was overflowing with messages containing words like monster, psychopath, and thief. I opened my venture capital firm's primary business page. The review section, which had maintained a flawless 5-star rating for years, was currently being bombarded with thousands of 1-star reviews. People I had never met were leaving vicious, hateful comments demanding my immediate resignation and threatening to boycott any company Vanguard Holdings invested in. My direct messages were flooded with graphic death threats and promises of physical violence. I opened Instagram, and the source of the digital lynch mob immediately revealed itself. Chloe was broadcasting live to her hundreds of thousands of followers. I tapped on her profile and watched the masterful performance unfold. Chloe was sitting on the edge of that same cheap floral motel bed, wrapped in a thin, scratchy blanket. She had perfectly orchestrated her appearance to maximize sympathy. Her usually flawless hair was tangled and messy. Her mascara was carefully smudged under her eyes to suggest hours of weeping. She looked directly into the camera, her lower lip trembling with practiced precision, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. I did not want to bring this online. Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking flawlessly as she addressed her massive audience. But I have a platform, and I need to speak the truth before she hurts anyone else. My sister Maya is severely mentally unstable. Last night on Christmas Eve, she suffered a complete psychotic break. She violently attacked my husband. She forged legal documents to steal our family penthouse, and then she physically threw my frail elderly parents out into the freezing snow. Chloe paused, letting out a jagged, heartbreaking gasp that earned a rapid flood of supportive comments and heart emojis from her enraged followers. "We have nothing left," Chloe cried, gesturing to the peeling yellow wallpaper behind her. "We are freezing in a roach-infested motel because Maya stole every single dime our family ever earned. She is a dangerous, bitter woman who has spent her entire life trying to destroy my happiness. Please, everyone, be careful who you do business with. Vanguard Holdings is run by a literal monster." I sat in my silk robe watching the viewer count climb past 50,000, feeling a chilling sense of déjà vu. This was Chloe's ultimate weapon. She had perfected this exact routine when we were children. Whenever she broke one of my toys or ruined something valuable in the house, she would immediately drop to the floor the second Richard and Patricia walked into the room. She would burst into hysterical, uncontrollable tears, pointing a trembling finger at me, claiming I had violently attacked her and destroyed the item out of pure spite. Our parents never asked for my side of the story. They simply comforted their weeping golden child and punished me severely for crimes I never committed. Chloe honestly believed she could scale her childhood manipulation tactic to a global audience. She thought she could weaponize the internet to destroy my company, force me into hiding, and extort a massive financial settlement to make the bad press disappear. She was leveraging the victim role she had practiced her entire life, absolutely convinced she had won the war. My phone vibrated in my hand, displaying a call from Sarah, my executive assistant. I swiped to answer, keeping my eyes fixed on Chloe's tearful broadcast. "Boss, are you seeing this absolute garbage online?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp and thoroughly unamused. "Our public relations team is already drafting a cease and desist, but the social media algorithms are pushing her live stream everywhere. She is causing serious reputational damage." "Let her keep talking," I replied calmly, watching Chloe dramatically wipe a tear from her cheek. "The higher she climbs, the harder she is going to hit the pavement. Have legal prepare a defamation lawsuit, but hold off on releasing any public statements just yet." Sarah let out a dark, knowing chuckle. "I figured you would say that. That is exactly why I am calling you right now. Boss, remember the new security cameras you had installed in the lobby yesterday morning? The ones with the high-definition audio?" I sat up slightly straighter, my mind rapidly connecting the dots. "The new lobby cameras." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed, her tone turning positively lethal. "You requested the top-tier cameras with integrated directional audio recording systems. They went live at 6 in the morning yesterday. I just remotely accessed the server and pulled the unedited footage from the lobby approximately 20 minutes before you came downstairs to confront them last night." Patricia and Chloe were waiting by the elevators completely alone, and they were talking loud enough for the directional mics to pick up every single pristine syllable. "Send it to my secure terminal right now," I ordered, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. I opened my laptop and clicked the encrypted file Sarah had just transferred. The high-definition video quality was flawless, but the crystal-clear audio was the true prize. The footage showed Patricia and Chloe standing near the marble pillars waiting for Richard and Julian to arrive. "We just need to stall Maya for a few more weeks." Patricia's voice echoed through my speakers, dripping with arrogant malice. "Once Julian's crypto fund matures, we can easily pay back the bridge loan." "But what if Maya checks the deed records before then?" Chloe asked, checking her reflection in a compact mirror. "She is paranoid about her money." "Let her check." Patricia laughed, adjusting her mink coat. Richard already forged her signature on the transfer authorization. The bank accepted the fraudulent documents without asking a single question. "We use the penthouse as collateral, and there is absolutely nothing she can do about it. By the time she realizes we bled her dry, we will have doubled the money, and she will be too humiliated to go to the police. We own her." I closed the video file, the sweet sound of their undeniable explicit criminal confession ringing in my ears. Chloe was still broadcasting live on my tablet, begging her followers to seek justice for her devastated innocent family. I picked up my phone, my smile sharpening into a weapon, and prepared to drop the financial guillotine. I did not waste a single second arguing in the comment section of Chloe's livestream. Engaging with a narcissist on their own manufactured turf was a rookie mistake, and I was not a rookie. I forwarded the encrypted security file to Sarah with a single line of instruction. "Post it everywhere. No captions, no corporate PR spin, no press release. Just the raw, unedited footage. Let the world see exactly who they are." While Chloe continued to weep for her audience, dabbing at her eyes and begging for donations to a freshly launched legal defense fund, the official Vanguard Holdings social media accounts simultaneously dropped the video. The high-definition lobby footage began circulating immediately. In the video, the audio was crisp and damning. Patricia stood adjusting her mink coat, her voice echoing with sneering elitist contempt. She looked directly at Chloe and laughed. "You just turn on the waterworks, darling. These gullible peasants will believe any tearjerker story you feed them on that app. They love throwing their hard-earned pennies at a pretty crying face." Chloe's voice followed, light and dripping with arrogant amusement. "I know, Mom. It is almost too easy. Julian just moved the stolen cash into a decentralized offshore account. Those idiots won't even notice the money is missing from his sister's fund until we have already tripled it. Maya is going to look like an absolute maniac when we spin this. The internet mobilized with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking to witness. The tide of public opinion did not just turn, it became a violent digital tsunami. I watched Chloe's live broadcast on my tablet. For the first 2 minutes, she was oblivious to the catastrophic shift happening in the background. But then the comments flooding the side of her screen began to change. The sympathetic heart emojis and prayers vanished, replaced by a rapid-fire stream of pure outrage. Users began spamming links to the Vanguard video, comments demanding she explain the lobby footage multiplied by the thousands. The words fraud, thief, and gullible peasants dominated the chat. Chloe's fake tears stuttered to a halt. She leaned closer to her screen, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion as she read the incoming vitriol. I watched the exact second her brain registered the catastrophe. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and terrified. Her hands shook violently as she reached forward and abruptly ended the broadcast, cutting the feed to black. The viral counterstrike was absolute. Within 2 hours, my corporate email was flooded with notifications of a completely different nature. The major lifestyle and beauty brands that sponsored Chloe's lavish influencer lifestyle were publicly severing ties in real time. Cosmetic companies issued rapid apologies for their association with her. Luxury fashion brands terminated her contracts via public statements on Twitter. The digital empire Chloe had built on a foundation of lies and manipulated sympathy was burning to the ground. She had tried to leverage the exact same victim role she had perfected since we were children. Whenever she broke my toys or ruined my school projects, she would instantly force tears to her eyes, running to Richard and Patricia to claim I had violently attacked her. She always escaped punishment, and I always took the blame. But the internet was not our blindly devoted parents. The internet demanded receipts, and I had just provided a mountain of undeniable high-definition proof. Her classist cruelty and deep-seated narcissism were exposed for the entire world to judge. She was officially canceled bankrupt and socially radioactive. The holiday weekend passed in a blur of satisfying corporate victories and frantic unanswered voicemails from my disgraced relatives. When Tuesday morning arrived, I walked into the sleek glass and steel lobby of Vanguard Holdings headquarters, feeling utterly untouchable. The storm had cleared, leaving the city bright and freezing. I settled into my top-floor corner office overlooking the sprawling financial district, ready to officially begin the asset liquidation process for Julian's seized holding company. My perfect solitude lasted exactly 12 minutes before the outside world decided to intrude once again. The sharp, incessant buzzing of my personal cell phone broke the absolute silence of the penthouse. I ignored the first 3 calls, assuming Richard had found another cheap motel phone to harass me from. But then my primary business line began to ring simultaneously. My tablet screen lit up with a cascading waterfall of notifications. Dozens of alerts turned into hundreds within a matter of seconds. I set my champagne glass down on the mahogany table and picked up my device, my eyes narrowing at the sheer volume of digital chaos erupting across my screens. My corporate email inbox was overflowing with messages containing words like monster, psychopath, and thief. I opened my venture capital firm's primary business page. The review section, which had maintained a flawless 5-star rating for years, was currently being bombarded with thousands of 1-star reviews. People I had never met were leaving vicious, hateful comments demanding my immediate resignation and threatening to boycott any company Vanguard Holdings invested in. My direct messages were flooded with graphic death threats and promises of physical violence. I opened Instagram, and the source of the digital lynch mob immediately revealed itself. Chloe was broadcasting live to her hundreds of thousands of followers. I tapped on her profile and watched the masterful performance unfold. Chloe was sitting on the edge of that same cheap floral motel bed, wrapped in a thin, scratchy blanket. She had perfectly orchestrated her appearance to maximize sympathy. Her usually flawless hair was tangled and messy. Her mascara was carefully smudged under her eyes to suggest hours of weeping. She looked directly into the camera, her lower lip trembling with practiced precision, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. "I did not want to bring this online," Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking flawlessly as she addressed her massive audience. "But I have a platform, and I need to speak the truth before she hurts anyone else. My sister Maya is severely mentally unstable. Last night on Christmas Eve, she suffered a complete psychotic break. She violently attacked my husband. She forged legal documents to steal our family penthouse, and then she physically threw my frail elderly parents out into the freezing snow." Chloe paused, letting out a jagged, heartbreaking gasp that earned a rapid flood of supportive comments and heart emojis from her enraged followers. "We have nothing left," Chloe cried, gesturing to the peeling yellow wallpaper behind her. "We are freezing in a roach-infested motel because Maya stole every single dime our family ever earned. She is a dangerous, bitter woman who has spent her entire life trying to destroy my happiness. Please, everyone, be careful who you do business with. Vanguard Holdings is run by a literal monster." I sat in my silk robe watching the viewer count climb past 50,000, feeling a chilling sense of déjà vu. This was Chloe's ultimate weapon. She had perfected this exact routine when we were children. I vividly remembered my 10th birthday when she had deliberately smashed my grandmother's antique music box. Before the fragile pieces had even settled on the hardwood floor, Chloe had thrown herself down shrieking that I had shoved her into the table in a jealous rage. She would instantly burst into hysterical, uncontrollable tears the second Richard and Patricia walked into the room, pointing a trembling finger at me. Our parents never asked for my side of the story. They simply comforted their weeping golden child and punished me severely for crimes I never committed. Chloe honestly believed she could scale her childhood manipulation tactic to a global audience. She thought she could weaponize the internet to destroy my company, force me into hiding, and extort a massive financial settlement to make the bad press disappear. She was leveraging the victim role she had practiced her entire life, absolutely convinced she had won the war. My phone vibrated in my hand, displaying a call from Sarah, my executive assistant. I swiped to answer, keeping my eyes fixed on Chloe's tearful broadcast. "Boss, are you seeing this absolute garbage online?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp and thoroughly unamused. "Our public relations team is already drafting a cease and desist, but the social media algorithms are pushing her live stream everywhere. She is causing serious reputational damage." "Let her keep talking," I replied calmly, watching Chloe dramatically wipe a tear from her cheek. "The higher she climbs, the harder she is going to hit the pavement. Have legal prepare a defamation lawsuit, but hold off on releasing any public statements just yet." Sarah let out a dark, knowing chuckle. "I figured you would say that. That is exactly why I am calling you right now. Boss, remember the new security cameras you had installed in the lobby yesterday morning, the ones with the high-definition audio?" I sat up slightly straighter, my mind rapidly connecting the dots. "The new lobby cameras." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed, her tone turning positively lethal. "You requested the top-tier cameras with integrated directional audio recording systems. They went live at 6 in the morning yesterday. I just remotely accessed the server and pulled the unedited footage from the lobby approximately 20 minutes before you came downstairs to confront them last night." Patricia and Chloe were waiting by the elevators completely alone, and they were talking loud enough for the directional mics to pick up every single pristine syllable. "Send it to my secure terminal right now." I ordered, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. I opened my laptop and clicked the encrypted file Sarah had just transferred. The high-definition video quality was flawless, but the crystal-clear audio was the true prize. The footage showed Patricia and Chloe standing near the marble pillars waiting for Richard and Julian to arrive. "We just need to stall Maya for a few more weeks." Patricia's voice echoed through my speakers, dripping with arrogant malice. "Once Julian's crypto fund matures, we can easily pay back the bridge loan." "But what if Maya checks the deed records before then?" Chloe asked, checking her reflection in a compact mirror. "She is paranoid about her money." "Let her check." Patricia laughed, adjusting her mink coat. Richard already forged her signature on the transfer authorization. The bank accepted the fraudulent documents without asking a single question. We use the penthouse as collateral, and there is absolutely nothing she can do about it. By the time she realizes we bled her dry, we will have doubled the money, and she will be too humiliated to go to the police. We own her. I closed the video file, the sweet sound of their undeniable explicit criminal confession ringing in my ears. Chloe was still broadcasting live on my tablet, begging her followers to seek justice for her devastated innocent family. I picked up my phone, my smile sharpening into a weapon, and prepared to drop the financial guillotine. I watched Patricia's lobby meltdown on the security feed for exactly 10 seconds before hitting a single button on my desk console. I instructed David to have building security escort my mother out and ban her from the premises permanently. Her fraudulent contract was a desperate, empty threat, and I had zero interest in entertaining her public hysteria. I simply closed the laptop and turned my attention back to the city skyline. I had more satisfying matters to consider. Across the river in Queens, my sister was currently receiving the ultimate reality check. Chloe stepped out of the cheap rideshare vehicle and stared in absolute horror at the crumbling brick facade of the apartment building. The address I had given her belonged to a property I had acquired very early in my real estate portfolio. It was the exact same building our parents had banished me to a decade ago when Chloe demanded my childhood bedroom to use as her secondary walk-in closet. She dragged her single scuffed duffel bag down the steep, cracked concrete steps into the dark basement stairwell. She pushed the rusty key I had given her into the deadbolt. The heavy door groaned open, revealing a cramped, windowless studio apartment that smelled heavily of damp concrete and age. She flicked the light switch, illuminating peeling linoleum floors and a severely sagging ceiling. Chloe dropped her bag and walked over to the tiny kitchenette. She turned the rusted metal faucet, and a stream of thick brown water sputtered into the sink, coughing air and sediment. The single radiator in the corner clicked and hissed weakly, barely radiating enough heat to combat the freezing winter chill seeping straight through the foundational walls. Her panic rapidly morphed into pure, unadulterated outrage. She pulled out her phone and dialed the building superintendent's number listed on the peeling welcome sheet taped to the back of the front door. The line picked up after 3 rings. Chloe immediately launched into a hysterical, screeching tirade. "I demand a room upgrade this instant!" she shrieked, pacing the short length of the tiny room. "The water is brown, the heat is completely broken, and this mattress looks like it was pulled out of a dumpster alley. Do you have any earthly idea who I am?" The superintendent was a gruff, broad-shouldered man named Hector, who had managed my entry-level properties for 5 years. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed loudly through the phone speaker. "Yeah, I know exactly who you are," Hector replied, his voice dripping with absolute zero sympathy. "You are the boss's deadbeat sister." Maya left very clear, specific instructions. You get the basement unit exactly as it is, rent-free for 30 days. You complain to the other tenants you break a single building rule, or you call me again with that entitled attitude, and you are out on the street tonight. Welcome to Queen's Princess. The line went dead. Chloe stared at her phone screen in utter shock. She stripped off her remaining designer coat, leaving herself in the cheap synthetic tracksuit she had bought with her last remaining cash. She collapsed onto the lumpy, stained mattress pushed into the dark corner of the room. The ancient metal springs dug sharply into her spine. For the first time in her pampered, fiercely protected existence, Chloe was experiencing genuine, unavoidable poverty. There was no room service to call. There were no adoring fans leaving comments. Julian was facing federal prison, and Patricia was cut off from the family wealth. Chloe pulled the thin, rough blanket over her shivering shoulders as the subway train rattled beneath the street outside, shaking the entire foundation. The morning sunlight did not reach the basement. Chloe woke up stiff, freezing, and desperate to distract herself from the crawling, claustrophobic feeling of the dingy room. She decided to organize the only storage space available, a shallow, dusty closet built directly into the foundation wall. She aggressively pulled out an old, rotting wooden shelf, tossing it onto the linoleum floor. As she kicked away a pile of accumulated dirt and debris, her sneaker caught on the edge of a loose floorboard. It lifted slightly with a hollow, distinct thud. Chloe frowned. She dropped to her knees, using her fingernails to pry the heavy plank completely out of place. Hidden in the dark, recessed cavity between the wooden floor joists was a small, heavy metal object. She reached down into the darkness and pulled it out. It was a rusted, heavy steel safe box. She wiped away the thick layer of grime with her sleeve, revealing a faded brass plate on the top. It bore the initials of our late grandfather. I had hidden it there 10 years ago, when I lived in that exact unit, terrified our parents would find it and destroy the contents. I had left it behind in my haste to move out when my first company finally secured major funding, and I had simply never looked back. Chloe's eyes widened with sudden greedy desperation. A hidden safe box could mean emergency cash, old bearer bonds, or forgotten jewelry. She scrambled to the kitchenette, grabbing a rusted flathead screwdriver from the single drawer. She jammed the metal tip into the rusted lock mechanism, throwing her entire body weight against the handle. With a loud metallic snap, the ancient latch broke apart. She threw the heavy steel lid open, her hands shaking with anticipation. But there was no money inside. There were no diamonds. Instead, the box was stuffed with yellowed, heavily folded documents. Chloe grabbed the thick stack of papers, her frustration mounting instantly. She pulled the top document loose and flattened it against the floor to read it. It was a certified medical record from a highly prominent fertility clinic dated exactly 9 months before Chloe was born. Attached to it by a rusted paperclip was a sealed legal adoption certificate. Chloe froze completely, the breath catching sharply in her throat. She frantically flipped to the next page, then the next, reading the bold, undeniable print. The documents spelled out a devastating truth. Richard and Patricia were not her biological parents. She was not the genetic heir to the family empire. She was not the golden child born of their perfect union. Every single thing she believed about her identity, her inherent superiority, and her rightful place in the family hierarchy shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the cold basement floor. She sat paralyzed on the peeling linoleum, her eyes frantically scanning the brittle pages again and again. The adoption certificate she had initially misread in her blind panic was actually a legally binding declaration of paternity filed by Richard, deliberately falsified to cover up the truth. Attached to it was a highly classified non-disclosure agreement and a DNA test from a private clinic dating back 30 years. Richard was not her father. Patricia had engaged in an extended affair with a massively wealthy married industrialist. The meticulously recorded bank ledgers at the bottom of the rusted safe box detailed monthly wire transfers of exorbitant sums. Richard had not stayed with Patricia out of love or duty. He had stayed because Patricia ruthlessly blackmailed Chloe's biological father for decades, using the threat of a paternity scandal to fund their lavish, elite lifestyle. Chloe shoved the yellowed papers into her pocket, her hands shaking violently. The cheap synthetic fabric of her tracksuit clung to her sweating skin as she ran out of the basement. She did not bother calling a rideshare. She scrambled onto the subway, enduring the gritty morning commute, driven by pure, unadulterated shock. She marched blindly through the financial district, practically vibrating with a toxic mix of terror and rage, until she reached the towering glass facade of Vanguard Holdings. My security detail intercepted her immediately in the lobby, but I had already seen her erratic approach on the street-level cameras. I pressed the intercom button and instructed David to escort her directly up to the penthouse office. The heavy oak doors of my suite swung open. Chloe stumbled inside, bypassing the leather guest chairs completely. She marched straight to my desk and slammed the stack of ancient, crinkled documents down onto the polished obsidian surface. Her chest heaved. Her face was entirely devoid of color, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "What is this?" Maya Chloe demanded, her voice a shrill, broken whisper. "Tell me this is a sick joke. Tell me you forged these to mess with my head." I did not even flinch. I slowly closed my laptop, folded my hands perfectly on my desk, and looked up at her with absolute unwavering calm. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to stew in the agonizing reality of her own discovery. I found that safe box 5 years ago, I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the massive office. I was living in that exact miserable basement apartment, scrubbing floors to pay my tuition after our parents completely cut me off. I pried up a loose floorboard to hide my emergency cash and found grandfather's insurance policy against his own daughter's greed. He knew exactly what Patricia was doing. He kept the receipts because he knew one day she would push her luck too far. Chloe swayed on her feet, clutching the edge of my desk so hard her knuckles turned stark white. "You knew," she gasped, staring at me as if I were a ghost. "You knew my entire life was a lie, and you just let me keep living it. Why didn't you leak this to the press? Why didn't you destroy them?" "Because I refuse to stoop to the level of common blackmailers," I replied smoothly. "I build empires. I do not tear down families using petty inherited secrets. I left that box right where I found it, because I knew that if you were ever desperate enough, greedy enough, and ruined enough to end up in that basement, you would inevitably dig your own grave." I stood up, walking slowly around the edge of the desk, until I was standing merely inches away from her trembling frame. I looked down at the sister who had spent her entire existence mocking my ambition and flaunting her status as the untouchable favorite. "You always thought you were so special?" I said, my tone lethal and precise. "You thought they showered you with designer clothes, luxury cars, and endless praise because you were inherently better than me. You thought you were the golden child born of their perfect union." Chloe let out a strangled sob, shaking her head in frantic denial, but I did not stop. "You were the golden child, Chloe, because Mom needed you to secure her hush money. You weren't loved. You were an asset. You were a walking, talking monthly deposit from a terrified billionaire who wanted to keep his real family intact. The second that money dried up, the second Julian was arrested, and their accounts were frozen, they threw you straight to the wolves. They never loved you, Chloe. They loved the leverage you provided." The words struck her with the devastating force of a physical blow. The final illusion of her pampered superior existence evaporated into thin air. Chloe collapsed to her knees on the expensive carpet, wrapping her arms around her stomach as she broke down into raw, hyperventilating sobs. There was no camera rolling to capture this performance. There was no influencer audience to manipulate. This was the terrifying, agonizing reality of a woman discovering she had never possessed any genuine value at all. I stood over her, feeling absolutely no pity. I remembered the night I had been evicted during my sophomore year of college. I had stood in the pouring rain, banging on the door of Chloe's luxury apartment, begging for a place to crash just for one night. She had cracked the door open, dressed in couture, and laughed in my face. She told me my depressing poverty would ruin the vibe of her party, and slammed the door shut, leaving me completely alone in the freezing rain. Before I could instruct security to remove her from the premises, the massive flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of my office automatically flared to life. Sarah had programmed the system to override all feeds whenever Vanguard Holdings was mentioned on major broadcast networks. The bright, colorful set of a prominent national daytime talk show filled the screen. The studio audience was completely silent, captivated by the guest sitting opposite the famous host. It was Patricia. She had somehow managed to book a live prime-time interview. She was utterly unaware that her deepest, darkest secret had just been unearthed from a basement floorboard and was currently sitting on my desk. She wore a modest, conservative dress, her face devoid of its usual harsh makeup, to emphasize her fabricated sorrow. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, staring directly into the television cameras. She was playing the ultimate weeping mother, embarking on a final fatal mistake to completely destroy my corporate reputation on live national television. "My daughter Maya has become a ruthless, heartless monster," Patricia cried to the millions of viewers watching at home. "She stole our family company through deception. She threw her own flesh and blood onto the street. I am here today to warn the world about the sociopath running Vanguard Holdings." I stared at the television screen, listening to her weave a web of desperate lies. I reached down, picked up the stack of DNA evidence and blackmail ledgers from my desk, and smiled. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number reserved exclusively for high-level media executives. The CEO of the broadcasting network answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I informed him that the guest currently weeping on his flagship daytime talk show was a prime suspect in an active federal investigation, and I was holding the physical evidence of her crimes. I offered him a choice. He could let Patricia continue defaming a major financial institution and face a catastrophic corporate lawsuit, or he could invite me onto the stage right now to deliver the highest television ratings his network had seen in a decade. He chose the ratings. My private driver broke several traffic laws getting me across Manhattan to the broadcast studio. I bypassed the standard security checkpoints escorted directly through the backstage labyrinth by the frantic lead producer. We reached the heavy soundproof doors just off the main stage. Through the monitors, I could see the live feed of the brightly lit studio. Patricia sat elegantly on a plush velvet couch, dabbing at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She wore a perfectly tailored conservative dress designed to make her look fragile and grandmotherly. The host of the show, a seasoned veteran named Diane, leaned forward with a look of practiced deep sympathy. "I gave her everything," Diane Patricia said, her voice wavering with expert precision. "I nurtured Maya. I loved her unconditionally. I sacrificed my own happiness to ensure she had the tools to succeed. And the moment she acquired her billions, she discarded us like trash. She evicted her own sister. She threw her elderly parents out into the freezing snow. I am not here out of anger. I am here because my heart is broken, and I want to warn the world about the kind of person running Vanguard Holdings." The studio audience let out a collective audible murmur of sympathy. Several women in the front row shook their heads in dismay. Patricia soaked up their pity like a sponge, her performance absolutely flawless. Diane nodded slowly, her expression grave. "It is a heartbreaking story, Patricia. To see a family torn apart by greed is always tragic, but we pride ourselves on hearing all perspectives on this program." Diane paused, reaching up to press a finger against her earpiece as the control room fed her the cue. She looked back at Patricia, her journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. "So we decided to invite a surprise guest to share her side of the story." Patricia's delicate, tragic smile completely froze. "Please welcome the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, Maya," Diane announced, gesturing toward the stage entrance. The heavy doors slid open. I walked onto the brightly lit stage. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoed through the silent studio. I did not scream. I did not yell. I wore an immaculate charcoal power suit, my posture radiating absolute untouchable authority. Patricia looked like she had just seen an apparition. The blood drained from her face so fast, her heavy foundation appeared instantly chalky. Her hands gripped the velvet cushions of the couch, her knuckles turning bone white. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords completely failed her. I walked past her without offering a single glance and took my seat in the leather armchair directly across from Diane. I crossed my legs, folded my hands in my lap, and gave the host a polite, chilling smile. "Thank you for having me, Diane," I said, my voice perfectly level and broadcasting clearly through my lapel microphone. "I appreciate the opportunity to clarify the public record." Before Diane could ask her first question, I raised my right hand, signaling the studio doors. 4 of my corporate legal aides marched onto the stage in unison. They carried massive certified blow-up boards, the kind used as visual exhibits in federal courtrooms, and positioned them directly behind my chair. The studio audience gasped as the oversized documents were displayed under the bright studio lights. "Let us address these accusations with facts rather than theatrical tears," I stated, gesturing to the first giant board. "This is a high-definition enlargement of a bank transfer authorization. You will notice the signature authorizing the transfer of my personal penthouse into a fraudulent holding company. Beside it is a certified report from an independent handwriting expert confirming the signature was forged by the woman sitting on your couch." Patricia let out a strangled, breathless noise, sinking lower into the velvet cushions as if trying to physically disappear. I gestured to the second board. "This is a comprehensive financial ledger detailing 20 illegal high-interest bridge loans taken out under my name, funneling millions of dollars into offshore accounts controlled by my mother and my brother Julian. Julian, for the record, is currently residing in federal custody for wire fraud. The audience was completely silent. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from sympathetic mourning to electrified shock. I turned my head and looked directly at Patricia. Her eyes were wide and frantic, darting toward the stage exits. "My mother did not come here for family, Diane," I said, my voice ringing out with devastating clarity. "She came here because the FBI froze her offshore accounts this morning. She has zero access to her stolen funds, her credit lines are severed, and she is attempting a desperate media extortion play to force me into a settlement." Diane leaned forward, her eyes practically gleaming at the live television goldmine unfolding in front of her. She looked at the giant boards, then at Patricia's crumbling, terrified face. "But I brought one more document," I continued, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal register. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the rusted, yellowed papers Chloe had slapped onto my desk an hour ago. I leaned across the table and handed the original DNA test results and the accompanying blackmail ledgers directly to the host. Diane took the papers. The studio camera zoomed in over her shoulder as she scanned the 30-year-old medical records and the meticulously detailed bank deposits. Diane's eyes widened to the size of saucers. She looked up from the paper, staring at Patricia with an expression of pure, unadulterated journalistic shock. She realized she was holding the kind of scandal that ended careers and ruined legacies. Diane turned directly to Patricia, her voice echoing through the silent, captivated studio. "Is it true, Patricia, that you extorted Chloe's biological father for 25 years? Patricia went completely silent. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly around the studio like a trapped rat, desperately searching for an escape route that did not exist. She looked at the cameras, then at the audience, and finally at me. She realized in real time that her deepest, darkest, most profitable secret was now public knowledge. The illusion of her perfect aristocratic marriage was dead. The lie she had sold to Richard, to Chloe, and to the world was permanently destroyed. The live audience gasped in absolute shock, the sound rippling through the studio as the camera held tight on Patricia's ruined, completely devastated face. My legal team had federal prosecutors on speed dial. I handed the original physical documents to Sarah, who immediately secured them in an evidence lockbox, while I forwarded the high-resolution digital scans straight to my contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Patricia thought she was launching a masterful public relations war, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just confessed to corporate defamation on live television, while a federal dragnet was actively closing in on her exact location. Within 2 hours of the broadcast ending, the legal hammer dropped with absolute merciless precision. Patricia had returned to the same cheap, crumbling Queens motel where Richard had been hiding out since the Penthouse eviction. They barely had time to celebrate her televised performance, likely pouring cheap champagne into plastic cups, before the motel room door was violently breached. Federal agents swarmed the cramped, dingy room in a coordinated tactical raid. Patricia shrieked, clutching her designer pearls as heavily armed officers forced Richard face down onto the stained floral carpet. The arresting officer loudly read them, their Miranda rights listing multiple federal charges of wire fraud, grand extortion, and aggravated identity theft. Patricia aggressively demanded to speak to her lawyers haughtily, insisting she was an innocent victim of corporate theft, but the agents ignored her hysteria. They simply secured the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists and escorted them both out into the freezing night, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting federal cruisers. 72 hours later, the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan was a complete media circus. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a pristine navy power suit, radiating an aura of untouchable calm, as I watched the final destruction of the people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. Patricia and Richard sat at the defense table. Stripped of their tailored suits and expensive jewelry, they looked small and pathetic in their standard-issue orange jumpsuits, their arrogant postures entirely broken. Chloe sat 2 rows behind them, looking hollow, sickly, and terrified, clutching her designer purse to her chest like a flotation device on a sinking ship. The real devastating blow did not come from the prosecution. It came from within their own ranks. The heavy oak side doors of the courtroom opened, and Julian walked in wearing a sharp suit and a desperately eager, sweating expression. He bypassed the defense table entirely, ignoring Patricia's furious glare, and took the witness stand. In a calculated, cowardly bid to secure a federal plea deal and save his own skin, Julian was testifying against his own family. The prosecutor approached the stand, asking Julian to verify the comprehensive financial records he had voluntarily surrendered to federal investigators. Julian leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing loudly through the silent, captivated courtroom. He detailed the entire sickening conspiracy without a single ounce of hesitation. He explained exactly how Patricia and Chloe had conspired to use my stolen assets illegally, liquidating the Penthouse equity, to silently fund his fraudulent cryptocurrency accounts. He threw them both under the bus, eagerly offering up every shred of digital evidence he possessed to avoid a maximum prison sentence. The betrayal among the villains was absolute and total. To corroborate his testimony, Julian pointed directly to the prosecution's display screens. He testified that he had maintained meticulous encrypted digital backups of every single fraudulent transaction to protect himself from Patricia. He explicitly confirmed handing over the primary ledger, stating for the public record that the first crucial piece of evidence was a file you can reference named Duyen Mao 1_24.docx. He did not stop there. He rapidly outlined how Patricia had systematically tracked her extortion money from Chloe's biological father, pointing to the second digital log, confirming there is a file you can reference named Duyen Mao 2_24.docx. The defense attorneys frantically tried to object, but Julian was unstoppable, eager to spill every toxic detail. He mapped out the complex illegal offshore routing used to hide the stolen Penthouse funds, verifying there is a file you can reference named Duyen Mao 3_24.docx. Finally, to absolutely bury Richard's direct involvement in the initial identity theft, Julian provided the digital fingerprint of the forged deed transfers, stating loudly that there is a file you can reference named Duyen Mao 4_24.docx. Patricia sat at the defense table, her jaw hanging open in absolute shock. Julian, the man they had bankrolled, protected, and treated as a true son, was cheerfully delivering them to a federal penitentiary just to shave a few years off his own inevitable sentence. He looked directly at Patricia from the witness stand and gave a pathetic, unapologetic shrug, offering a weak excuse about needing to protect his own future. The presiding judge, a stern, unyielding woman with zero tolerance for high society fraud, slammed her wooden gavel down to restore order in the chaotic courtroom. She looked at the mountain of irrefutable evidence, the digital logs, the DNA test results, and the decades of extortion ledgers. She declared Patricia and Richard extreme flight risks, citing their frozen offshore accounts and their demonstrated brazen history of identity theft. Bail was immediately and unequivocally denied. The bailiffs moved in quickly to escort the prisoners back to the subterranean holding cells. Patricia completely panicked. The harsh reality of a cold concrete cell finally shattered her aristocratic delusion. As the armed officers grabbed her arms, she twisted violently, turning frantically toward the gallery, her wild eyes locking onto Chloe. "Do something, Chloe!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. "Call the media. Post on your social accounts. Get our lawyers on the phone right now. You are my daughter, do not just sit there." Chloe slowly stood up from the hard wooden gallery bench. She looked at the weeping, hysterical woman in the orange jumpsuit who had lied to her for her entire life. She looked at the forged documents displayed on the prosecution screens. She looked at the man who was not her real father, currently being dragged away in chains. The absolute truth finally crushed the last remaining fragments of her towering entitlement. Chloe did not scream. She did not cry. She simply turned her back on her toxic parents and walked straight out of the heavy courtroom doors, her footsteps echoing in the absolute silence, finally realizing that aligning with them had cost her absolutely everything. The echo of those heavy oak doors closing marked the definitive end of a toxic era. 6 months later, the dust from that explosive federal trial had finally settled over the Manhattan skyline. I sat at my polished obsidian desk in the Vanguard Holdings penthouse, the morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The absolute silence in my office was no longer a luxury I had to fiercely defend against manipulative intruders. It was the permanent, peaceful reality I had built from the ground up, brick by meticulous brick. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the crisp, conditioned air and the complete absence of family drama. Patricia and Richard were currently adjusting to their highly restricted new reality. The federal judge had shown zero leniency during their sentencing hearings. They were both serving extensive double-digit terms in separate federal penitentiaries. The swift hand of justice had stripped them entirely of their designer wardrobes, their offshore accounts, and their fabricated aristocratic identities. They were no longer the elite, untouchable socialites of Manhattan. They were simply federal inmates wearing standard-issue uniforms. Julian had narrowly avoided prison time by turning state evidence and singing like a canary on the witness stand, but his betrayal came with a heavy, inescapable price. He was officially bankrupt, stripped of his fraudulent crypto assets, wearing a federal ankle monitor, and confined to a tiny, sparsely furnished apartment under strict house arrest. The empire of lies they had collectively maintained for decades was completely and permanently eradicated. But Chloe had faced the most severe reality check of all. Without Patricia's illicit hush money or Richard's stolen credit lines to fund her manufactured influencer lifestyle, she had been forced to drop the glamorous facade entirely. She still lived in that exact same crumbling, windowless basement apartment in Queens. Hector, my superintendent, sent me routine monthly updates on her tenancy. Chloe was currently working double shifts as a barista at a high-volume, relentlessly busy local coffee shop just to make rent and buy groceries. Her perfectly manicured hands were now burned from steam wands and heavily calloused from scrubbing industrial espresso machines. The crushing weight of actual exhausting physical labor had stripped every single ounce of arrogance from her posture. She took the crowded, noisy subway at 5 in the morning. She wore a stained apron instead of haute couture. She was no longer the untouchable golden child. She was just another New Yorker struggling to survive the brutal realities of independence. I turned my attention back to the thick stack of legal documents resting on my desk. These were the final liquidation orders. My legal team had spent the last half-year meticulously dismantling the remaining shell companies Patricia and Richard had hoarded. I picked up my pen and signed the authorization forms, officially reclaiming every single dollar they had illegally siphoned from my grandmother's original trust. It was a massive, staggering sum of money, but I did not absorb those funds into my personal corporate portfolio. Instead, I transferred the entire reclaimed fortune into a newly established philanthropic foundation. I designed the organization specifically to provide emergency financial grants, aggressive legal counsel, and secure housing support for young women actively escaping financial abuse and toxic family dynamics. I was ensuring that no other young woman would ever have to choose between her physical safety and her family's manipulative financial control. It was the exact safety net I had desperately needed 10 years ago. I pulled the last document from the pile. It was a formal, irrevocable legal decree severing all remaining familial and financial ties with Richard and Patricia. It officially erased them as my next of kin, barring them from ever claiming a single cent of my estate or making medical decisions on my behalf. I signed my name with a smooth, decisive stroke. The legal tether was officially broken. I was entirely free. The quiet hum of the intercom broke the comfortable silence of my office. Sarah requested permission to enter, stepping into the room a moment later, carrying the morning mail. She bypassed the standard corporate correspondence and placed a single, crisp, white envelope directly in the center of my desk. There was no corporate letterhead, no return address, but I instantly recognized the looping handwriting on the front. It was from Chloe. I stared at the envelope, a cold wave of skepticism washing over me. I assumed I knew exactly what was waiting inside. It would undoubtedly be another desperate manipulative plea for cash. It would be a lengthy, victimized sob story about how unfair her new life was, demanding that I rescue her from the basement apartment and restore her lost luxury lifestyle. I fully expected a masterclass in guilt tripping, perfectly mirroring the extortion tactics our mother had taught her. I grabbed a silver letter opener and sliced the envelope open. I unfolded the single sheet of lined notebook paper and began to read. My cynical expectations shattered immediately. The letter contained no demands. There were no requests for financial bailouts, no complaints about the grueling barista shifts, and zero attempts to play the victim. Instead, I found a genuine, heartbreakingly honest apology. Chloe wrote with a raw, unprotected vulnerability I had never witnessed in her before. She explicitly admitted her lifelong consuming jealousy. She confessed that she had mocked my ambition and my independence because she was absolutely terrified of her own manufactured, entirely dependent existence. She acknowledged that she knew she was a fraud, and she hated me because my success forced her to confront her own emptiness. She acknowledged the monstrous way she had treated me when we were younger, detailing the specific moments she had actively chosen to act as Patricia's weapon against me. The ink on the page was slightly blurred at the edges, visibly stained with dried tears. The words were messy, hurried, and profoundly sincere. She did not ask me to move her out of Queens. She did not ask for a job at Vanguard Holdings or an advance on her rent. She explicitly stated that she intended to keep working, to keep struggling, until she figured out how to be a real functioning human being. She ended the letter with a simple, profound plea for eventual forgiveness, stating that she finally understood the true cost of her complacency and the horrifying reality of what our parents truly were. I set the letter down on the obsidian desk. I looked out over the sprawling city, the morning light catching the steel and glass of the skyscrapers. The war was over. The villains were locked away, the fortune was reclaimed, and the golden child had finally woken up. I picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of my desk. I did not need to reply today. For the first time in my life, time was entirely on my side. I let the silence of the office settle around me, staring at the closed drawer where Chloe's letter now rested. A younger version of me, the girl desperate for a sisterly bond, would have immediately reached for the phone. That girl would have paid her rent, offered her a lucrative position at Vanguard Holdings, and eagerly swallowed the poison just to taste a single drop of family affection. I was no longer that girl. I had spent years meticulously untangling myself from their web of deceit, and a single tear-stained letter was not going to unravel that hard-won independence. I pulled a piece of heavy monogram stationery from my desk organizer. I uncapped my fountain pen, the gold nib catching the afternoon sunlight, and let it hover over the thick cream paper. I did not write a sprawling, emotional manifesto. I did not offer a sweeping absolution or an immediate invitation to meet for coffee to hash out the past. I simply wrote the absolute truth, honoring her new honesty while fiercely protecting my own peace. I accept your apology, but healing takes time. Do the work, Chloe, maybe one day. I folded the note with precise, deliberate movements, slid it into an envelope, and wrote down the address of her basement apartment in Queens. I handed it to Sarah when she returned to the office, instructing her to send it through standard mail. There was no rush. I felt no lingering guilt, no heavy, suffocating obligation to play the savior for a woman who had happily watched me drown for decades. The boundary I had just drawn was entirely impenetrable. I did not have to save my sister, and I absolutely refused to let the phantom ghost of familial guilt manipulate me ever again. If Chloe truly wanted a relationship, she would have to build her own solid foundation first, completely independent of my wealth. 8 months later, the bitter, biting cold of winter swept through Manhattan, transforming the chaotic city into a glittering, silent snow globe. It was Christmas Eve, a holiday that had historically been a treacherous battlefield in my life. I vividly remembered past holidays, sitting at long, intimidating mahogany tables, enduring passive-aggressive insults from Patricia, forced smiles from Richard, and Chloe's arrogant theatrical demands for expensive gifts. Tonight, the Vanguard penthouse was fundamentally unrecognizable from those dark, toxic memories. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of my past was entirely eradicated, replaced by the rich, savory scent of a roasting turkey, fresh herbs, and the unmistakable, beautiful sound of genuine, uninhibited laughter. I walked through the main living area, adjusting the placement of a polished silver candelabra on the dining table. The space was alive with pure, unfiltered warmth. A massive, elegantly decorated fir tree stood proudly near the floor-to-ceiling windows, its warm white lights reflecting off the dark glass and casting a golden glow over the room. But the true breathtaking beauty of the evening was not the expensive holiday decor or the five-star gourmet catering I had arranged for the night. It was the specific people filling the room. I had curated my guest list with the exact same ruthless, uncompromising precision I applied to my corporate acquisitions. There were absolutely no blood relatives present. Instead, I was surrounded exclusively by the family I had actively, consciously chosen for myself. Sarah stood by the roaring marble fireplace, laughing loudly at a joke told by my lead corporate counsel. My earliest professional mentor, the brilliant woman who had fiercely guided me through my first brutal years in the tech industry, was cheerfully pouring glasses of expensive vintage wine for Hector, my building superintendent. Hector had brought his wife and two young daughters, and the girls were currently sitting on my plush living room rug, completely mesmerized by a classic holiday movie playing on the massive screen. There was zero underlying tension in the room. No one was calculating their next manipulative move or sizing up the competition. No one was nervously waiting for a sudden, vicious insult, disguised as a polite compliment. We were just decent, hardworking people who fundamentally respected and valued one another, sharing a beautiful meal in absolute unshakable peace. The comforting heat of the bustling penthouse and the lively overlapping chatter eventually pushed me toward the expansive outdoor terrace. I grabbed a thick woven cashmere shawl from the back of a leather armchair and draped it over my shoulders. Sliding the heavy glass door open, I stepped out into the freezing, crisp winter air. The sudden vast quiet of the terrace was a sharp, beautiful contrast to the festive warmth inside. Snow was falling softly over the Manhattan skyline, dusting the concrete, glass, and steel with a pristine, silent layer of white. I walked slowly to the edge of the balcony, resting my bare hands on the freezing metal railing. I held a crystal glass of deep red vintage wine, the dark liquid catching the ambient, colorful city lights below. I looked out over the sprawling, infinite grid of New York City. Below me, millions of people were fighting their own private battles, navigating their own complex family traumas, and searching desperately for their own versions of peace. I thought about the philanthropic foundation I had recently launched, with Patricia and Richard's reclaimed fraudulent wealth. Somewhere down there in the snowy city, young women were sleeping safely in secure housing, protected by fierce legal counsel, completely free from the financial abuse that had almost destroyed me. I turned my head slightly, catching my own reflection in the dark mirrored surface of the penthouse glass doors. I studied the woman looking back at me with intense scrutiny. She did not look exhausted. She did not look frightened or diminished. She stood perfectly straight against the freezing wind, wrapped tightly in cashmere, radiating a quiet, absolute, and terrifying strength. She was fiercely independent, wildly successful, and completely, undeniably unbroken. The generational cycle of toxicity, the endless greed, the vicious manipulation, and the aristocratic cruelty that had poisoned my bloodline for decades had finally met its permanent, immovable end. It died the moment I refused to play their twisted game. I raised my crystal glass toward the glowing, snowy skyline in a silent, solitary toast to the massive empire I had built and the peace I had fiercely protected. The snow continued to fall gently from the night sky, burying the toxic past completely and forever. I let out a slow, steady breath, and a triumphant, deeply peaceful smile spread across my face as the world around me slowly faded to black. The most profound lesson from Maya's story is that true peace requires establishing impenetrable boundaries, especially with toxic relatives. For years, Maya endured relentless manipulation and financial abuse. Her ultimate triumph wasn't merely exposing their crimes, but consciously deciding to stop playing their savior. By accepting Chloe's genuine apology, yet refusing to rescue her from the consequences of her actions, Maya proved that healing doesn't require sacrificing your own well-being. True family is built on mutual respect and chosen bonds, not obligatory suffering. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace? Share your experience in the comments below.